the 10 talking points that are typically cited. The first is a lack of attendance at stamp shows by youth. That's number one. Number two is a lack of bricks and mortar stamp shops. So people will point to the fact that there are no more stamp stores. Okay, a third one is that I've seen is that you can't buy stamps at department stores anymore or at hobby shops the way you could 30 or 40 years ago. A fourth one, and this is probably one of the most oft cited ones, is that you can't get your kids interested in your stamp. A lot of boomer collectors will complain that they can't get their children or their grandchildren interested in the hobby, and therefore in their mind there's no new blood, no new collector, and no future to the hobby. The fifth is hardly anybody uses stamps anymore on day-to-day mail, and therefore because there's not a lot of mail around, that there's going to be very little um, actual exposure to stamps um, for children, and therefore, because they can't see them, they're not going to know the hobby exists, and they're not going to get into stamps. Okay, the sixth talking point is that modern issues are too plentiful, and that countries are issuing too many stamps, and that's going to turn collectors off and prevent them from taking up the hobby. 11th, and probably the second most often cited talking point, is that kids today only want to play video games or be on their phone, and there's just no interest in anything outside of that. The eighth talking point is people's attention spans are too short for a hobby like stamps, which requires the ability to focus for long periods of time. The ninth talking point, and this would be probably about the third most often cited talking point, is that the stamp market has collapsed and it proves that the hobby is dying. And finally, the 10th talking point is that there are supposedly fewer stamp collectors today than there were 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. So, in dealing with all of these 10, I'm going to start with the last one first. And I'm going to ask all of you to think about, as we're going through this, think about a hobby that you know of other than stamps. Okay, go back in your mind and look at a hobby that you have seen in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years that was extremely popular and mainstream at the time it was first introduced, or the time it first became popular, and that has waned in popularity over time. So just think about that for a minute. I'm going to give you just a few seconds here. Come up with a hobby in your mind other than stamps. Okay. Now, if you've got a hobby in mind, I'll give you one of mine examples, and that would be video games, but on consoles. So back in the early 80s, most families had an Atari game, and families would sit around in their family room playing Atari games on TV. And this would be around 1981, 1982. They were very, very popular. Almost everybody I knew had an Atari. Then in 1982, Intellivision, which was, I believe, Mattel company, upgraded and released a product that was better than Atari. And a number of the households in my neighborhood upgraded to it, but not everybody did. Then shortly after that, you had the Commodore VIC-20 computers and Commodore 64 that took it to the next level. And even fewer people then upgraded to that. And then eventually after Commodore, you had the Nintendos and the game consoles that got the play, and they got more and more and more sophisticated. But as they got more sophisticated, the video games got better, they got more complicated, they got harder to play, and they got more expensive. And you went from having a hobby that was very mainstream, very popular, where entire families were playing, to a hobby now that's still pretty mainstream, but it's aimed mostly at very serious gamers and people who play competitively. And most video games today are very complex. I mean, they're amazing when I see them compared to what I saw as a child, but most of them require a lot of practice, and they're not something that you can just pick up a controller and play casually with little to no knowledge. And so now, why am I mentioning all this? Well, because what it illustrates is what I call um, the nicheification of hobbies. So, with a few exceptions, mostly those hobbies that are physical, sporting hobbies that are done outside. Most hobbies that involve collectibles or um, art, collectibles that are hobbies, I should say, that are done in private at home. Those typically go through a process where they go from being mainstream to being niche hobbies. That's common for every hobby. If you go back and look at um, the hobbies that were popular in the 60s, for example, what you find is if you go back and research what were the popular hobbies other than stamps in the 1960s, you find it's things like model rockets and model cars kits. Hot car racing was extremely popular in the 1960s. Soap carving, sand art, drive-in movies were popular. I mean, I don't know if I'll call that a hobby, but I've seen sources online that say that's a hobby. And if you look today, I mean, all of those hobbies that were mainstream back then are very obscure hobbies today, but none of them are dead. If you go and you look now, if you go and look up soap carving online, you'll see extremely or carvings made out of soap. We're talking about roses in open bloom with full petals. I mean, something that would take hours and hours to carve with the most expensive tools and probably special kinds of soap that you would have to buy from a supplier. Whereas in the 1960s, when the hobby first appeared, you were probably carving bars of ivory soap, that you found in the house with a pocket knife, and you were carving something fairly rudimentary. So the hobbies go from being very simple and casual and mainstream to being more and more serious and more expensive. And therefore, because of that, they become niche hobbies because not everybody has the patience or the inclination to pursue the hobby seriously. And so with stamps, I believe that's what's happened um, as well. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, you had um, stamps being collections being viewed and stamps being sorted and mounted in albums, by families that would sit around in their living room, and each person would partake in some aspect of the hobby, whether it was soaking stamps or sorting them or mounting them in the album or looking at them. Whereas today, most stamp collectors are very specialized. They are after better and better stamp, and you don't see the ability now to go and buy, very rudimentary collector kits for beginners, and that's a normal part of the evolution of any hobby. Now, that then raises the question, or what is a hobby? How do we define what makes something a hobby? Because, there's all different people having different pastimes, such as going shopping and watching TV and walking and going for bike rides and collecting stamps and playing Dungeons and Dragons and all these different pastimes. How do you decide what constitutes a hobby or what makes something a hobby? Think about that for a minute, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think it is. Okay, have you got an idea? Okay. So I think what makes a hobby typically is that there is some element of knowledge or skill that a person tries to master or learn or develop in the pursuit of the hobby. And that it's the desire to master and develop that skill or learn that body of knowledge or complete the collection of objects that provides the spark or I should say, the fuel that keeps the spark of interest alive. Whereas a hobby like a pastime like watching TV is really just a form of pure consumption. It's not, there isn't anything specific that you're trying to master or build on. Whereas a hobby like collecting stamps, you're building something. You're building a collection, you're learning about the stamps themselves, you're developing your body of expertise and knowledge. And that is what's keeping your interest alive. And so most hobbies need to have a source of supply. They need to have um, more material or something to strive for in order to keep the interest alive. So most hobbies that tend to dwindle in popularity do so because there isn't enough to keep the interest alive beyond the initial thrill um, of whatever it is you're doing. So for instance, when I was a child, gyroscopes were very, very popular, and they were quite neat. Pops were pretty interesting too, but there's very limited marginal utility to that after you've spun the gyroscope a few times or you've spun the top. So there isn't a lot to keep the interest alive there. Whereas with stamps, there's an infinite body of material out there for people to collect. So it's one reason why it's remained popular for as long as it has. Now, in terms of the number of collectors, it's really a difficult thing to verify because there's really no census or no records available going back 100 years or 50 years or 60 years for us to compare to. But in my online research, what I did find were statistics that suggested that roughly 1% of the world's population collected stamps or collects stamps. So if I go through the actual statistics that I've written down here, in 1950, the global population was 2.5 billion. So if the percentages hold up, then there would have been about 25 million collectors in 1950. In 1960, it would have been about 30 million. And in 1980, it would have been 44 million if the 1% holds up across the board. Now, the research that I've done recently says that with the world's population at 8.2 billion, at 1%, that would suggest a figure of 82 million collectors. But the figures that I have from Stanley Gibbon say that there are 60 million collectors worldwide, approximately, of which 20 million are in China. A third of the world's collectors are in China. And I would guess that probably another 1/6 to 1/3 are in India. There's India and Pakistan, the hobby is extremely popular. So what that says is that yes, on a percentage basis, there are fewer collectors today probably than there were in 1950. And the distribution of those collectors is split between the two large developing countries, China and India, and the rest of Europe and North America. So that there is a lower percentage of collectors in North America and Europe, but on an absolute scale, in terms of the number of people, it's higher than it was in 1950 because the world population has grown by quite a lot. It's actually more than tripled since 1950. So the absolute number of collectors is probably larger today than it was in 1950. And that would have implications on the prices. Okay, so that's the first talking, or the last talking point, which I wanted to deal with first. Now I'm going to get into the other ones and I'll go through them in order. So starting with the first one, which was, just going to see how we're doing for time here. It's now, yeah, so I'm about 20 minutes in. Okay, so the lack of youth attendance at stamp shows. Now I talked to Mike Walsh, who runs, he's the Canadian Stamp News publication, and he runs the collector show out in Mississauga. And he tells me that the show attendance has gone up about 25 or 30% since COVID. That show gets well over 1,000 people on a weekend. Stampex, which is held in London, by the Philatelic Traders Society. I know I'm a member of the PTF, and each time they hold a Stampex, they talk about how the attendance records are always hot. They're always being broken. Now, Stampex is both virtual and physical, but there's no records that are kept as to the actual age demographic breakdown of people at shows. And I would suspect that the number of youth at stamp shows probably isn't very high. That's true. Does that mean that the hobby's dying? I don't think so. I think that the lack of youth at a stamp show could be attributed to a couple of factors, but the main one being that most dealers that go to these shows, they have fairly high table fees and travel costs to cover, so they tend to bring only a very small portion of their stock with them. It's usually the more expensive material. I mean, there's a few dealers who bring everything, and they bring cheap and expensive stamps, but the vast majority of dealers at the shows are bringing higher end material that young collectors either can't afford or are probably not interested in, at least not yet in their journey. The one thing I will say about shows is that I don't see them doing a particularly good job of welcoming in newcomers. And by that I mean, I don't see tables set up at shows where you as a brand new person to the hobby can walk up and get information on how do I get into this hobby? How do I navigate it? Can I buy a beginner's kit that has a pair of tongs, a magnifying glass, a pack of stamps, and a book right here, right now for $25 or $30 so I can get my feet wet? And then maybe get a brochure that gives me the addresses of the major stamp web, gives me the names of some dealers, and maybe helps me navigate eBay and Hipstamp. There currently at shows isn't anything like that. Usually there's just a whole series of tables for dealers. And so if you're brand new to the hobby, you don't know anything about it, you're going to be intimidated, and you're not always going to want to approach the dealers because a lot of times they're busy. They have their regulars at their tables, and some of them are not very welcoming if they don't think you're going to spend money on them. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I know when I was here about 2 months ago, we had a collector show locally, and I always stay until the end of the show. But one of the things that a lot of dealers will do is they'll start packing up early. So if the show goes till 3 o'clock, you'll see dealers packing up their booth at 2. And I hate that. I think that's really, really bad, because what invariably happens is you'll get young people wandering in at 2:45 or 2:30, and they're looking around. They're all stoked to go look at stuff, but there's nothing to look at. And I don't know about you, but if I'm a young person and I show up at a show and that happens, I'm probably not going to go back. So I think the lack of attendance by youth at stamp shows has a lot more to do with how the shows are set up and what the dealers are catering to, rather than the actual hobby itself. Now, the other thing is they don't advertise the shows very well a lot of times, in the sense that they tend to put the ads for the shows in stamp publications. So people who are in the hobby know about them, but nobody else does. Okay. So you all with me still? So now we're going to look at lack of bricks and mortar stamp shops. Now this one, I think, it's a demographics issue and a technology issue, all coming together at the same time. And to illustrate this, I'll go and talk about Weta Stamps, which some of you know about. They're now run by Furman Windells, and they're over on Vancouver Island. But when I worked there in 1989 and 1990, they were on Richard Street in Vancouver, and I worked for Chris Weta. And Chris was born in 1934. And he was Dutch, and he was computer illiterate. And he had a fantastic stamp knowledge, But everything that Chris was used to was on paper and it was manual. And his rent when I was working for him was for a fairly large size store on West Pender Street, downtown Vancouver, was about $1,500 a month in 1990. And he told me that in order to make it worthwhile, in order to make a living, he had to sell about $1,000 worth of stamps a day, which he usually did. The majority of his business was the weekly bid board, and Saturday tended to make up for all the other days of the week, where we would only be getting $100 or $200 of business a day. So he made it all up on Saturday. Now, in the short time that I worked there, his rent went up twice. And by the time I left, he was starting to murmur about how it was very slowly becoming not worth his time and effort because of the rent increases. A couple of times he said that he'd be better off selling all the stock, putting it into treasury bills, and collecting the interest. And so I think that that's one of the major reasons why bricks and mortar stamp shops closed down, or why most of them have closed, is because the rents for commercial property are so high that you need to sell a lot of stamps in order to cover the cost. And the problem is, you don't get enough sales from walk-in traffic and the local collecting population to make it work. Now, if you have an online strategy and you're running online auctions like I do, and you have a store, I think that can probably work. Problem, of course, is you have to be computer literate, and you have to know the internet, and you have to have a skill set that most of the older dealers who were around in the 1990s and the early aughts just wouldn't have had. And at that point in their lives, most of them were, in their minds, too old to learn these things. So I think, a lot of the dealers who were around in the 1990s and early 2000s, I think they simply just decided it wasn't worth it anymore and they closed up. I don't think it had anything to do with a lack of demand per se, or the impending death of the hobby. I think it simply just didn't make sense for them personally anymore. And they didn't have a crop of young aspiring dealers to sell their businesses to. That's the other thing. Because of this belief that has held for so long that the hobby is dying, a lot of parents probably weren't very supportive of their children wanting to become stamp dealers. I know mine weren't. I mean, I really wanted to become one from the moment I worked for Chris. But my parents both wanted me to go back to university and get a real job, as they put it. So I don't think I was alone. And so a lot of these dealers just wouldn't have had anybody young who knew computers, who had the skill set to make having an online store actually work. Now, the other thing is, and this will be the eighth talking point, which is the state of the stamp market itself and the belief that the stamp market has collapsed. Of course, if you have been into stamps for a long time, if you've been into stamps for more than 25 or 30 years, you have witnessed a decline in values. There's no doubting that. Stamps that you used to pay $100 or $200 for, 85 or 1990, you can pick up for $40 or $50 today, quite easily. Sometimes less, sometimes 20, sometimes 15. So it's natural when you see those declines to think, okay, well, the stamp market has collapsed because it should be worth more. I was paying way more before. But the problem with that analysis is that it doesn't take the technological development and the impact of technology on the market and on effective scarcity into account. So if we go back and we look at the stamp market of, say, 1985, what we would have seen is we had no internet. We had just our local dealers who were bricks and mortar. That was essentially our market. I mean, for all intents and purposes. I mean, yes, you could write to a dealer in another country or across the country, and you could inquire on whether they had the stamps you wanted. and you could wait for their response. But that was a tremendously time consuming thing. And you typically wouldn't do that. You would just deal with your local dealer. There were some auction houses that would send out catalogs, but they wouldn't send you a catalog if you didn't bid in at least one out of every three of their sales. So they would send you one, but then unless you paid for it, if you gave them $25 or $30 a year, they would continue to send their catalogs. But you would have to be in a position to spend at least $100 typically to buy anything in them. There were some auction houses back in the 80s that would only do business with you if you were a registered dealer. Um, they would not sell to you if you were a collector because they wanted to protect the dealer community from having to compete with their own customers. So that environment created a lot of what could be termed artificial scarcity for a lot of what I would call blue chip stamps. Stamps that are, they're not rare, they're scarce. I mean, they do have a value, the type of stamps that you can just phone somebody up and buy 100 of. But at the same time, they're not so rare that if you went looking for them, you wouldn't find one in the space of a couple of weeks. You know, they're readily obtainable. But, you know, back in the 80s and before, you might actually have to wait several months or a couple of years to find what you could easily locate online now in a couple of weeks. So what the technology has done with the internet and with the lowering of barriers to entry to the stamp business is it's made everything far more available. And that's the other thing. If you wanted to be a stamp dealer in 1985, because there was no internet, there were very, very, very high capital barriers to entry. You had to have a large stock to appeal to all your customers. You had to advertise in print, which was extremely expensive, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a year. And most people didn't. Most collectors had no way of selling their stamps or their duplicates except to take them to a dealer. And a lot of times, a dealer wouldn't be interested in them. If you went to a dealer with $100 or $200 worth of duplicates that cataloged, you know, $5 or $10 a stamp, they wouldn't be interested. They would say to you that it wasn't big enough of a lot for them to. So you would have to accumulate your duplicates, and then years and years later, when you've got thousands of dollars worth, you could go to your dealer and sell them. And that's what people did. So, you know, a lot of the material availability was much lower back then because people held on to their duplicates. Also, you know, a lot of collectors in the 1980s were born in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, and they were still actively collecting. I mean, they were in their 50s and 60s and early 70s back then. So they were still very actively involved in the hobby. They had a lock on a lot of the really expensive, scarce material, a lot of which was not available on the market. And it was much harder to find a lot of material than it is today. I mean, since the internet has taken off, a lot of those collectors have died. Their collections have come onto the market. Collectors have gone onto eBay and Hipstamp and set up little shops, and they regularly sell their duplicates. And so what's happened is the entire market has opened up. It's become very competitive, and it's become truly competitive and international in a way that it wasn't. So in order to reach a valid conclusion that the market has collapsed, you have to look at what would have happened in, say, the 1950s or the 1920s or the 1970s if the internet had been around back then. Because I suspect that if the technology existed back then, the prices would have been very similar to what they are. Adjusted for inflation, of course. I don't think that the drop in prices is indicative of a drop of demand. It's simply an increase of supply. the way one thing that supports that notion is the fact that the drop in value has not been constant. So if the hobby was dying, you would expect to see year over year drops in value and continual decline. And what you would also start to see is areas of philately and collections that you wouldn't be able to sell or find an interested buyer in at any price. That even if you gave it away for free, you would not have any takers. And you don't see that. I mean, everything, frankly, within this hobby has a value, and there's always a buyer. It's just a question of what the price is. And actually, most of the value, if you look at historical prices, most of the drop in value that occurred in the market happened between about 1990 and 2005. And the majority of that would have happened in the early 2000s. Since then, there's been very few declines. And in fact, there's been mostly increases. A lot of areas that were previously not popular, such as South America, have gone up in value. India has gone up in value as Indian collectors have increased in number. China started going up in about 1990, and it's continued unabated. I mean, it's never ever going to go down, in my opinion. Very, very unlikely with the number of collectors there are in China. Now, that raises another interesting point that with 20 million collectors in China, what's likely to happen as the local Chinese issues continue to go up in value, there's going to become a point where they become unaffordable to the Chinese. And when that happens, we're going to see those collectors go and branch out into other countries. That much is pretty certain. And so when that starts to happen, you're going to see a lot of areas that were previously lukewarm go up in value quite dramatically because you've got so many collectors and so much demand and not enough to meet the demand. So I don't think the market has collapsed. I mean, I just don't see it. It's different from what it was, but to me, it's not an indication of a decline in the hobby. Okay, so the other third talking point on here was the lack of stamped kits or stamp packets or bags of stamps at department stores and places like. And I mean, that's true. You don't see, when I was a kid, you used to be able to go to Kohl's bookstore and buy Kiloware in bag. You could get packets of 100 different, Canada, all mounted on a board, wrapped in cellophane. And you could get that for Canada and worldwide, and you for it. And you could pick up a couple of rudimentary albums at those stores too. And that goes back to what I said about the hobby becoming nicheified. So, back when I was a child, there were enough casual collectors. There were enough kids that were collecting to get their Boy Scout that it made sense for a department store like I think Zellers had them. So Zellers had some, the Bay had some. And then, of course, there was Kohl's. It made sense for them to carry beginners packets because there was enough people buying them. I mean, packets are very labor intensive. There's not a huge profit margin in them, as any packet maker could tell you. And so you need a pretty good amount of volume to make them worthwhile. And as the hobby has gotten more and more serious, there just isn't the demand for that entry-level material sold in. That material would be very well received, I think, at stamp shows where new people show up, but it's not something that a store like Walmart is going to think is profitable enough to carry. But again, that doesn't necessarily indicate that. It simply indicates that it has reached a level of sophistication where the profitable area of it lies in stamps that are beyond the expertise of a department store. That's the reason also why the stamp counters and the stamp shops that used to be in the department stores like Eaton's um, eventually, because hey, um, that happened because there just wasn't the demand for the material that they had. Okay, so then the fourth talking point about getting your kids interested in your. So I was looking at to research this. I wanted to look at hobbies in general and what makes people start them. And think back to what got you involved in stamps. Think about how you got involved in the hobbies that you have, if you have other hobbies besides stamps. And then ask yourself, how much of that was due to parental or grandparent influence? And how much of it was you deciding that you wanted to try something and then simply seeking it out? The studies that I've looked at online say that the majority of people who are pursuing hobbies do so because they make a decision to go. And that can be as simple as deciding that you go to a craft fair because you want to see if you can get into the hobby of crafting. You go to a stamp show because you want to see if it's the thing for you. You go to a comic book convention because you want to see if comic books are the sort of thing you think you could get into and collect, or if you'd be into comics. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're serious at that point at all, but you make a decision that you're going to try it out. The study that I looked at online said that 67% of the adults that were surveyed had more, and another 18% had just one hobby, making up 85% of the respondents, one that they pursued seriously to the exclusion of almost everything else. And then the last 15% had no. And of those people, only 25% actually reported that they got into their hobbies because their parents had gotten them into it. Now, in addition to that, um, what was I thinking here? Okay, we'll go with those numbers for the moment. So if you are a parent and you want to get your kids into STEM, you've only got an 85% chance right out of the gate that they're even going to take all. And then you've only got a 25% chance on top of that. So really what you have is about a 20% chance that your children would be interested in stamps and or any hobby. It doesn't really matter what it is. So if you're finding that your children aren't interested in stamps, it doesn't mean that there's nobody interested in starting stamp collections. It just means that your children are interested in other things. And that's perfectly normal. It's rare to find children that want to do the same things as their parents. The other thing that it's dependent on too, and this is another point that I found when I went through the studies, is there were a lot of stories, especially on Quora, which is an ask, where they gave horror stories about how their parents or grandparents had forced them to try and take up a hobby. It was quite common when I was growing up for parents to limit TV, and quite often they would say, "Well, you have to do something other than watch TV." And I'm just gonna message somebody here who was trying to get on. He doesn't know about the Twitch. There we go. So they a lot of them were forced to take up a hobby, and so now as adults they go out of their way to avoid it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And then the last point in to tie all this together is that you have to remember something about the age group of your children as well, and what their overall motivation is. So when children are preteen, they typically they tend to emulate the people that they love. So they'll get into something because you're interested in it because they want to emulate you and they want to be close to you. But as a child enters adolescence and they become teenagers, they want to differentiate themselves. They don't want to emulate you. They want to be different from you. They want to do so. Whether or not they take up your hobby will have a lot to do with how you approach it with them. If you're very overbearing, if you're trying to tell them how to do the hobby, or if you're trying to get them to do it the way you do it, That's not going to work on a teen. It might work on a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, but it will not work. If, on the other hand, you take a very hands-off approach and you try to find out, you spend all your time trying to find out what's interesting to them, and you give them stamps that are a topic or an area that's interesting to them that you can see they're drawn to, and you don't try to give them too many rules um, on how they should be doing it, then it's going to go a lot better. And I'll get into attention spans, which was the other talking point. But again, you have to make it age appropriate for the attention span level of the child that you're dealing with. Because if you're trying to do um, too much, for a young child, they're going to tune out because they can't give it the attention that you can. So, just to summarize on that talking point, inability to get your children into your hobby is not an indication that the hobby's dying. It just isn't. It's simply an indication that your children have different interests from you, and that's normal. And there's about an 80% chance that would be the case. So then, the fifth talking point was that hardly anybody uses stamps anymore, and that kids wouldn't know the hobby exists because they don't see stamps on their mail. This one's a fairly easy one to debunk. I mean, there are people that have gotten into stamps because they started tearing them. But if you ask most people, most collectors, what you're going to find that them telling you is that the mail that came in the house was certainly a source of the stamps, and that they certainly could tear the stamps off the letters and soak them. It isn't seeing the stamps on the mail that got them into stamps. It's something. Um, and in fact, most people that get into the hobby now, they don't report. A lot of times they're seeking it out. They think it's interesting. They do know about it because um, they're aware of it. They see it online. If they're on eBay, they see there's a category for stamps, and they go check. And that's how they get into it. Another person I spoke to on Discord, which is another server that's different from Facebook, that person got into it because they were into Pokemon cards, and um, that naturally led them to stamps. So, I mean, yes, it does mean little mail. It does mean that there's less day-to-day visibility of stamps, and yes, there's going to be less awareness, but people who like antiques, who like vintage things, are going to come across them simply by virtue of attending antique fairs and looking at auctions and seeing that these things are out there, and they'll find the hobby. So I don't see that as being an indicator of the hobby dying. I mean, it does mean that maybe fewer children will get involved organically. But again, children is not getting involved in childhood is not always a prerequisite to being interested and seriously devoted to stamps as an adult. There are many, many collectors who are very serious philatelists who did not collect as children, who got into it as an adult and made up for lost time. So the sixth talking point was countries issuing too many stamps today, and that they're getting greedy and they're putting out too many new issues, and that's turning off a lot of collectors, and they see that killing the hobby. I mean, it's an interesting point. I know for a lot of older collectors, they got turned off by the number of new issues, and a lot of them stopped collecting. Now, I think a lot of that has more to do with their tastes. A lot of the older collectors like engraved stamps, and they have a distinct preference for them. And they don't really like the modern stamps that are lithographed or printed by photogravure or printed on different materials. They're not really interested in self-adhesives, which first appeared in the 1960s. They tend to view a lot of the alternate materials like the wooden stamps and the plastic stamps as just being junk. And I think a lot of that just has to do with their ingrained attitudes about what a stamp should look like. Um, and so, when they saw the new issues proliferating in countries and having a lot of different designs and a lot of different subject matter, it turned them off because it wasn't to their tastes. It is true that a lot of the postal administrations, because they've had such a sharp drop off in collector demand for new issues, they have started doing things that I think in the short run are not. So, as an example of this, if you look at a lot of booklets now, because well, first of all, let me back up. So most stamp issues now are coming out in booklets, not on sheets, and stamps are almost all self-adhesive now for most countries. There are very few paper water gum activated stamps being issued and produced now. And that's simply because self-adhesive has become a much cheaper way to produce them. It's a lot easier um, print large quantity, and a lot of people who don't like licking stamps, prefer the self-adhesives because they don't have to lick them. And it's just a more effective way to print them. So what a lot of countries have done is they've gradually cut back sheet production and they've put almost everything out in booklet form. And when they started to do this in the early 2000s, they would print the stamps in such a way that you could cut fairly easily a single out of a booklet and have a nice border around the stamp. And you didn't have to cut the perforations of the. But in recent years, they've started printing booklets where the stamps have no adjacent space, or the adjacent stamps have no space between them. The perfs literally abut right against each other, and so there's no way to cut them apart without really. I mean, you can hold them usually. You can cut the booklet with a very sharp razor blade from the back out to the front, but you still, even if you do that carefully, you still wind up with jagged edges. You can very easily cut the stamp and damage it, and it just doesn't look good to most collectors. So that forces a lot of people, if they want an issue, to buy either the whole booklet or one of the or three of the panes that the booklet is made up into. And, with most stamps costing over $1 now, it gets very, very, very expensive um, to print, or I said to collect all those stamps. So I mean that will, if they don't figure out a way around that, I do think that will have a um, slightly negative impact on. Um, but is it going to reduce the demand for stamps overall? I don't think so. It's simply going to mean that collectors are going to focus on different eras. Now, the one thing I will say is because the postal administrations have around the world experienced so much less demand for new issues, they don't print nearly. And if dealers continue to use current stamps on their mail and they continue, that there continues to be a discount postage trade, we are going to see a lot of the new issues. And I say that because if you go back to the 40s and 50s and early 60s, most commemorative issues in Canada were produced in quantities between 40 to 60 million of every stamp, which is why today, even after 30 or 40 years of discount postage use, you could still find 5-cent commemoratives. Not nearly as many as you could even 10 or 20 years ago, but you could still find them in quantity. You can still buy sheets, you can still get, um, you know, stacks and stacks of plate blocks. It's not hard to find this material. But then, you get into the 70s and 80s and the quantities drop to 25, 30 million, which is still a lot, still enough that you could still readily find it in quantity. But now if you look at most stamp issues, you're looking at under 1 million for almost everything, except most commemorative issues. There's maybe 5, 6, 700,000 of each. I've seen some issues like there was a sheet about 10 years ago, one of the Star Trek sheets. There's only 50,000 made. And that's an extremely low quantity. That's the type of quantity that you used to see in the 1930s on the souvenir sheets that are worth hundreds of dollars today. You would see those types of things being issued in quantities of under 100,000 or just a couple 100,000 items, and you're seeing a return to them. And so I predict that in the future, in about the next 40 to 50 years, stamps from 1995 up through the current time are going to be, commemoratives and limited edition stamps are going to be, and especially nice used, nice commercially used souvenir sheets are going to be next to impossible to find, and they're going to be worth quite a bit. They're going to be eagerly sought out. So I see some major opportunity with the new issues. But yes, are they expensive to keep up with on a yearly basis? They are. But the solution to that is, collect one booklet pane, cut singles where you can out of them, or collect the die cut to shape singles that you can get from Canada Post and a lot of other postal administrations where you can get the yearly stamps. You can collect the annual collection, and that's a good way to keep up with them without just buying one of each stamp. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of my talk here. I've just got the video games argument and attention spans left to talk about, and then I'll pause and I'll wrap it all up with my overall conclusions, and then I'll open up the floor for questions and comments. Just a sec here. So the seventh talking point is kids only wanting to play on their phones and playing video games. So if you think back, in order to look at that argument, you think about what you were doing when you were younger, other than STEM. You think about all the pastimes and things you did when you were younger, and you find that a lot of the things that were of interest, 40 or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, not into anymore. So just because children are into their phones and into, computer games and video games today when they're teens, it doesn't mean that when they're 30, 40, 50, 60 that they're still going to be glued to their phones. There's no evidence to suggest that. Everything, they're going to outgrow them. There's already a lot of evidence. If you look at studies done on millennials and Gen Z, you're going to see that the studies. You're going to see that a lot of Gen Z and millennial kids are becoming more and more aware of the dangers of social media use and the dangers of being online too much. There are a lot of kids now that are giving up social media for long periods of time, and sometimes for good, because they're no longer interested. They see that it has affected their mental health negative, or if they don't abandon it entirely, they're cutting back. So, and that's happening at a younger age. And I think actually as we become more aware of the consequences of this, and as our lives become more and more digital, and we get more and more of our working life is spent in front of a screen, that we're going to find a lot of people want to unplug. That they're going to want to engage in hobbies and activities that are not online. So I see that actually on the Discord servers and on some of the other areas where I see young people getting into hobbies, not just stamps, but knitting and baking and other things that they can do where they're unplugged from the online world. And they like the idea of having a ritual and having things that they can do. So I don't think that this particular observation again is an indicator that the hobby's dying. I talked earlier about the hobbies that were popular in the 60s and about how all of them became niche hobbies. And I think much of the same thing is going to happen with TikTok and with other apps and games that are on phones. We've already seen it with Facebook. I mean, Facebook used to be a very, very mainstream social media app for kids. Instagram also was as well, but you don't see as many young people on those platforms now. I mean, Facebook is primarily a boomer platform, and there aren't a lot of young kids on it anymore. So I don't see the idea that they're interested in video games or on their phone as being an impediment to collecting. Now, the other thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the hobby earlier is that there are different motivators that make people pursue hobby. So if you look at I looked up online what these motivators are, like what drives a person to pursue a particular hobby. And I found an article that talked about the thrill of the hunt, desire for completion, social connectivity, the joy of display, and investment potential. That's 5. Sense of control and order. 6. And escapism and personal identity as being major drivers for hobbies that are pursued. So if you look at the different hobbies and you examine them next to those drive, let's look at video gaming, for instance. So video games are very fast paced. There's definitely the thrill of the hunt because you're trying it, and it would translate for video gaming. It would translate into going up various levels, the thrill of getting to the next level, desire for completion, completing all the levels, finishing and mastering the game, social connectivity if you're playing with other gamers, so you're connecting with other users. But there's really no joy of display in gaming. It's so if you like to display things, you're probably not going to choose gaming as a hobby. Investment potential, not exactly the same. I mean, a gamer that wants to um, compete in tournaments can win prize money, but there's no investment potential to their actual gaming equipment and all the games that they've bought. Sense of control and order, yep, that would apply to gaming. Escapism and personal identity would apply to gaming. But the one thing that gaming wouldn't give you is joy of display and explicit investment potential, but stamps will. And so if you look at the hobby in terms of that, if you look at it in terms of the driver, there are going to be significant numbers of people that want what stamps offers that they can't get from other hobbies. And if you go back to all the factors I just listed, thrill of the hunt applies to stamps. Absolutely. Like looking for and finding that variety and finding that printing and finding that shade. And filling that missing space on the page. That's all thrill of the hunt. Desire for completion. Most stamp collectors look to get a collection complete as they possibly can. If we look at social connectivity, okay, there's older collectors certainly went to stamp clubs and shows with a very large social element, and a lot of them complain about lack of social connection online, which is odd because there's actually more opportunity online now to connect with other collectors than there ever would have been if you were a member of a local club. But the issue is you have to be comfortable using technology, understanding the internet, using the apps in order to benefit from that. And I think a lot of the older collectors who complain about that just simply don't have the knowledge to be able to use the apps comfortably and to get the social connection they want. Joy of display, absolutely. Exhibitors at stamp shows who put together exhibits are probably very, very, very heavily driven by this one aspect. Investment potential, Stamps, I mean, a lot of dealers will tell you that you can't or you shouldn't collect as an investment. And I mean, that's generally true if you're looking at um, short term. I have mixed feelings on this. I think you can collect for investment if you take a very long term approach and if you are specializing in an area that is highly knowledge intensive and you're uncovering new material and new scarcity. So a good example of this would be postal history. There are many instances where a collector goes and buys covers out of a dealer's junk box and researches the rates and researches the use and researches the route, and they get a cover that's later worth $600-700 that they paid 25 cents for. That happens all the time. It's because they've put a lot of work and a lot of research and time into developing and honing um, their knowledge base. Now, if you were to impute a value to their time, if you now treat it almost like a business, but yeah, it's not really, if you impute a time value to the amount of time they put in, it's not really a good investment because your theoretical wages for all your time spent would wipe out probably any profit that you're going to get from that. But assuming that you're doing it as a hobby, that you're truly in this as a hobby for enjoyment, then you wouldn't impute a value to your time. You'd just be looking at the difference between what you sold your stamps for and what you paid for them, and ignoring the time value of money over a 35 or 40-year period. Absolutely, you can get many multiples of what you spent back if you buy the right stamps and you pay for stamps that have upward potential. It's, if you're just buying stamps at top dollar today, then yeah, you're probably not going to have an investment that's going to be worth more than you paid. Sense of control and order is another very big one, and stamps offers that. I mean, you get some degree of control and order over having a complete collection, over being able to sort stamps. Just the act of physically sitting down and sorting stamps, control. Um, and your choice of collection and your choice of what to collect um, gives you a sense of identity, and you express yourself through what you choose to collect. It's I mean, stamps offers all of those things. Whereas if you look at a lot of other popular hobbies, they will offer most of them, but they won't offer them all. And that's probably the reason why that study that I quoted earlier that said that 67% of people had more than one hobby um, is because people need more than one hobby to get to tick all of those factors off. That one hobby gives them two or three of those, or satisfies two or three of those things, and a different hobby gives them something else. Also, some of their hobbies, if they're physical, are seasonal, and you can only pursue them at certain times. So the other big advantage stamps has is you can collect stamps all year long. It's not dependent. It's not like curling where you have to be at a rink or it has to be wintertime, or gardening where it has to be spring or summer. And once it's winter, there's really nothing you can do. You have to stop gardening for the season. So I think that's it. I'm just gonna look. Oh yeah, no, one last point. So the last talking point, and we're now an hour and 20 minutes in. So yeah, okay. So is people's attention span. So there's a lot of belief online that people's attention spans have dropped since we've gotten more and more digital. You hear a lot being said about young people's attention span going down. But when you look at the studies and when you look at the evidence that's presented online, that's actually not true. And it's not true because Attention span has been studied and found to be task dependent. So, yes, if you're online and you're reading something and you're looking for information, 10 years ago, your attention span might have been 2 minutes on a web page, whereas today it might be 45 seconds. But the reason for that is because the information has gotten so much easier to find. If you look at a lot of web pages now, there's hyperlinks in web pages a lot of times. A lot of pages are cross-referenced to one another. There's very smart and robust search features on pages that were not nearly as that are not they were not nearly as sophisticated before. So people will spend less time on a particular page when they can jump and find the information they want, and they see that they can do that. So measuring attention span by, say, how long somebody spends reading a web page is not necessarily indicative of their actual attention span. It simply may mean if they navigate away from a page, it's because they found the information they were looking for and they found it faster and they're on to the next page. Or they're not finding it and they can see very quickly that it's not going to be there and they're jumping to the next page to look for what they want. When they look at physical tasks such as reading and doing off tasks offline, several researchers found that there's almost no difference between the attention span of children doing those activities today versus doing them in the past. I mean, there's been a little bit of a difference, but it's not significant. And the thing that they have found is that if a person stops using social media or they go offline for a length of time, that their attention span will improve slightly, but it won't go up dramatically. What they have found is that attention span varies by age. So between the ages of about 5 and 7, okay, the average attention span for a child is about 18 to 24. Okay, between the ages of 13 and 15, that goes up to about 35 to 40 minutes. And it peaks in early adulthood. By the time you're about 21, 22, 23, you can focus for about 60 minutes. And that continues all the way into adulthood until about the age of 65 when it starts to drop again. And apparently by 65, the average 65-year-old, it's about 45 minutes. So that's pretty significant finding, because what it means is that if you're trying to introduce a child to philately, you're going to find that it's going to be very, very difficult to have their attention for more than 18 to 24 minutes and if you think about what you could talk about and what you can present in 18 minutes, it's not very much. I mean, I can easily see a scenario where you're showing your nephew or your niece or your grandkids or your children your stamp collection. I mean, you're 3 or 4 pages in and your 18 minutes is up. Your 24 minutes is up. If you're trying to explain the tools of the trade, stock books, tongs, I mean, you can't cover that in 18 minutes. So you're going to lose your children very, very quickly if they're that young. And even if they're teens, they're only good for 35 or 40 minutes. And my guess would be that a lot of adults who've tried to introduce their children to their hobby have probably not taken into account the fact that their kids can only pay attention for that much time before they tune out. So that's very much a food for thought there. Now, I will take a minute to explain that in line of that, what I'm doing with 5 other entrepreneurs from the hobby is that we're developing an app for children, and we're calling it and what it's going to be is a phone-driven app that's going to contain a curriculum with video classes for children starting at the age of 5 or so and working up to teens. And it's going to have the videos are going to be designed to be about 15 minutes long. So we're coming up with material and lessons um, that are age appropriate and are going to be available in an app form that a child can create an account, they can create a stamp album online that they can share, they can watch videos, that their progress will be tracked, and they'll get little gold stars or little bits of recognition as they complete the module. And the exercises and quizzes that they'll complete as they each level will be easy for them to do with given their age. So, for example, a child who's 5 will have lots of matching exercises where we give them pictures and we give them a little sentence and we ask them to match the picture to the text. Um, we will talk if we're giving a lesson about the different types of stamp. We might show them an example of each one, and that would be it. We wouldn't get into any detail beyond that. But then if we're doing a lesson for a teenage collector, we may get a little bit deeper into the different types of stamps and why they're issued and what purpose they served and things. So the app event will be tailored. The amount of detail will be tailored to the age of the child, and will be designed in such a way that we're not going overboard in terms of their attention level. Okay, so we're now at 4:30. That sort of brings me to the end of dealing with the individual talking points. I think you could see just sort of from everything I've said that I don't see any evidence of the hobby declining. What I see is a hobby that has become a niche hobby. It's been a niche hobby actually for probably about 30 years. It's gone from being mainstream to being a niche. It's evolving. It's gone from analog, bricks and mortar stores, physical clubs, um, and physical shows to being most of the dealers are now online. The clubs are online, like on Discord and on Facebook. The shows are slowly moving online as well, and we're getting Zoom and channels like this. I'm on Twitch right now, which is different from you, and that's what we're seeing with the hobby. So what I'm going to do now is go to your questions. I'm going to go see what people have been asking, and I'll try to address them as okay. So we got Brad, who seems to be the person asking most of the question. Hi, Brad. Nice to see you here. Oh, okay, then we got Tom. Tom's on here as well. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you. Oh, Johnny. Yeah, Johnny's here too. Yeah. Hey, Johnny. Okay, so it's mostly comment.
Some questions.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through here to see what, yeah, so Brad here says slot cars and for the most part, model railroading, both lost hobbies. Yeah, but they're still pursued, I think. They're just not as mainstream as they were. I mean, my father-in-law is into railroading and builds his own layouts, and they're very, very, very interesting. They have he spends hours, days designing buildings and items to go in his layouts. So it's still very much a hobby. It's just not it wouldn't be as mainstream because to do model railroading you need a lot of space. You got to have somewhere to put the layout. And what Brad has, that's my father-in-law, he's got a whole room. So you have to have a whole room that you can dedicate to putting that out. And a lot of people just don't have that when they're young. Okay, Brad says here he hands out candy and Halloween and also small bags of stamps. That's a great idea. Fantastic idea. Good way to get kids in. Okay, possible ban evader. Uh, okay, that's Johnny. Okay. Yeah, when I started looking at stamps in the living room, my 4-year-old loved looking at the stamps with me. Yeah. So, um, that's a good way to get kids into it. I mean, in Johnny's case, I know he's not trying to actually get um, it's just something that happens organically. If you know the art and the color actually appeals to the child. He says, "Yeah, it was quite fun." And, Johnny also goes on to say, "Can confirm outgrowing video games. Misses it, but there was a point where it wasn't teaching him anything new or valuable, and there were much better ways to spend time and learn something new." Okay, so the point that I made earlier, and it probably echoes a lot of hobbies. That unless you're going to get into it very deeply, and you're going to get into it competitively, or you want to spend your time mastering gaming, um, as a casual game player, you're going to find that there are better things to do. It's just the natural progression of things. Then we get back to Brad. So he says, on the downside of this whole topic, it appears that Unitrade may be out of business or at least on a hiatus. Gino was not able to vacate their premise. So for those who don't know, Unitrade is the publisher of the Canadian stamp catalog. And what Brad is referring to here is that last year, the owner announced that he would be retiring, put his business up for sale. And that's surprising. Brad and I thought that he would successfully sell it, and no, that's not good news for Canadian collectors. I myself have been speaking for quite a while about publishing my own catalog using all the data. The problem, of course, being that I'm so incredibly busy that I have no idea where I would get the time to be able to do that. But it's on my list. It's on my list of things to look at. But it is going to be difficult for collectors if they don't have a catalog. And he goes on to say, exposed my daughter hobby. My 18-year-old never took to it, but is a big video gamer. Okay. My 16-year-old tolerates stamps, so she'll look at my collection sometimes, but her main hobby is gymnastics. Yep. Well, I mean, not terribly surprising. Probably just have their own interests. But you might find, if you weren't, Brad, if you weren't actually forcing your stamps on those two, you may find one or both of them goes back to it. I would suspect your 18-year-old will probably never get into it. But your 16-year-old may find herself going back to it if there was even a passing interest there. As long as it's not been forced down her throat, um, there's always. And then, okay, more from Brad. Chris, you're in a position considering your weekly auctions to see growth or contraction in the hobby. How many regular buyers do you have? Is the amount of buyers continuing to grow, or has it peaked or even been reduced over the last 2 years? That's a good question. I would say over the last 2 years, it has grown steadily. I'm trying to think about attrition, and I can only really think, like, if I think back now to people I'm doing business with today versus people and people who've dropped out of the picture completely from, say, 2 years ago, I can only think of one or two people. I did have a couple who were very gung ho, bought from me every single week and disappeared during the pandemic. That has happened on a couple of people, but generally speaking, everybody who bought from me 2 years ago or 5 years ago is still buying from me now. I mean, not everybody's a weekly bidder. I mean, some people will bid every couple of weeks, some will bid every month. Some are seasonal. I've got some customers that I know I'm going to see starting in fall and winter. And when summer comes, I'm not going to see them because they put their stamps away for the summer and they pursue other hobbies. I can think of about a dozen collectors like. But generally speaking, the vast majority of the people in my auction are weekly buyers, and they buy something almost every week. I mean, more obviously some weeks than others because it's dependent on what I can give them and supply them with. But um, most people treat my auction like an experience, almost like a TV show that they want to watch. Um, so no, I think it's growing. I mean, it's not dramatic growth, but it is. Okay, so then Johnny. Sometimes planting the seed is enough. My family loved outlaw country music. I hated country music growing up. Um, but as I got older and I was looking for something familiar and comforting, I found myself listening to it. Yeah, yeah. So what Johnny's touching on there, I think, is true of a lot of hobbies where there's a latent interest that develops, and you're not always aware that it's one thing that tends to draw people to hobbies is nostalgia. That's a very strong element. So, I've heard from a lot of collectors who are getting into the hobby as retirees who were never really seriously into it when they were children. They might have had a little bit of a schoolboy stamp collection, but really they got in. Brian Carr actually is a good example of that. If those of you who are on my website who follow me regularly will be familiar with his collection because I have it up for posterity on my website. Brian didn't get into stamps. I mean, he was into stamps when he was a child. He talked about that in his biography. But his childhood stamp collection was not a serious collection. It wasn't a valuable collection. It was nothing compared to what he eventually had, and he didn't really start serious. He told me he didn't start seriously buying stamps like the Seaway inverts and other things that he had until, and he would have done that probably in his late 50s or his early 60s, and he's about 74, 75 now. So that collection of his that I sold, he acquired that over about a 15-year period, and it was not a lifelong pursuit. So there is a lot of hiatus involved for sure, and things that can develop out of the blue just based on some um, exposure. Okay, Johnny saying she loved the colorful one. Okay, Brad says he messed up in Halloween, accidentally mixed a pile of German Hitler stamps into the packages. Had to toss the whole lot, so no Halloween giveaway this year. I'm almost done. Oh, Glenn said, oh, Glenn, hi, Glenn. You got on here. That's good. I'm glad. I'm glad that you managed to make a Newfoundland. Yeah, yeah, I definitely, I mean, Newfoundland is a real challenge, Glenn, as you know. It's far harder to keep in stock and to keep getting, um, a supply of. I can't keep it in stock, so it's difficult. But definitely, I will for sure do some talks on Newfoundland. Um, Now that I've got all the technical stuff figured out, and you know, I think I'll have more listeners and viewers. I'll be able to get into that. And then Tom, yeah, hi Tom, glad to see you here. So Tom says, finally have my nephew, age 16, involved in collecting. He's a photography. We need mentors, ambassadors for the next generation. I hope the Stamp Academy will take off. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we need to have people promoting the hobby, but I think it's very, very important if we're going to promote it that we have to promote the modern material because of its topical interest. I saw on Discord this week there was somebody that was really excited about the new French love stamps. Now, my partner was interested in them too. When I sold the large world collection this year, and we got
It's true. It was.
there was about a 15-year run of these love stamps, and they were basically heart-shaped stamps that were issued in souvenir sheets of I think about 6 to 10 stamps a sheet. And I mean, the souvenir sheets themselves were just beautiful. The stamps were kind of unwieldy to tear out of the sheets because they were heart-shaped. So I would imagine most people just collected the sheets, but the person on Discord was saying that they were really excited because they'd now gone gender neutral, whereas all the issues up to that point had been, guy and girl. But they went gender neutral and they've become more inclusive. I saw when I did Finland, there was gay art There was one souvenir sheet, with a sort of motorcycle, guy with chaps and like a handlebar mustache and everything else, and it was a pencil sketch. I mean, that's the type of art. I mean, you would not have seen that, 10 or 20 years ago. That would never ever appear, but it would appeal to a young gay or lesbian collector who feels included and feels that there's something there that reflects themselves and their own identity. I think the amount of subject matter and topical interest that is on modern stamps, every single topic that you can think of is on a modern stamp. The problem with focusing only on the early stamps is that all you really have is rulers, and they're rulers that are long since dead. I mean, that's fine if you're into history and you just want to do that, but the problem is most young kids today, I mean, if they see a Queen Victoria stamp, they'll think it's cool. I mean, they'll think it's cool enough to own one, but they're not going to see much of a point in collecting just Queen Victoria stamps. It's not going to make any sense to them. In the way that, say, collecting the love stamps or collecting hot, which Canada has in abundance, or something like that that appeals to them. So I think if we're going to introduce and be good mentors and ambassadors for the hobby, we are going to we're going to have to do a much better job of recognizing that the interests of the young are not necessarily aligned with ours, and we can't take it personally. And we have to think that, the hobbies, it's a big enough tent for everybody, but if we want it to continue to be vibrant, we have to do a much better job of including them.